One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to the summer series of Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. Over the summer, we're revisiting some of the biggest and best stories from our live events and webinars from this year. And today we've got a special treat, our end-of-year wrap featuring our panel of journalists, Amy Ramikis from Guardian Australia, Pablo Vinales from SBS News, Adrian Rollins from the Canberra Times, and my colleague Stephen Long, Senior Fellow and Contributing Editor at the Australia Institute and former investigative journalist with the ABC's Four Corners program. This was originally recorded at Verity Lane Market in Canberra on Wednesday, the 29th of November 2023, and things may have changed since recording.
A lot to reflect on this evening, and we're really grateful to have our panel who've been watching politics up close and personal for the whole of this year, and a lot of them have come straight from Parliament to be here this evening, so we really appreciate their time. Pablo, I might start with you. Looking back on this year, what are some of the big key moments that really stood out for you in domestic politics?
Domestically, obviously, I think The Voice. That was, I think, a devastating loss, obviously, for First Nations people. We know from the voter turnout that, a large proportion voted in favour of A Voice. But then looking at the political implications now of that loss, obviously, I think the PM and the government has lost some paint when it comes to this, something that, they tied so closely to their agenda. I was there election night when they were the first words that Anthony Albanese said when he was elected. And I think just kind of now the impact for what this means for reconciliation going forward.
Yeah. And Amy, what about for you?
I mean, obviously, the Voice was the defining moment of this year. Not so much from a political point of view, but from how the campaign was run, how the opposition ran the campaign, and how a lot of mistruths and fears were able to take hold. And I think it really marked a new low in our politics. And it set the standard for how the rest of this term is going to go. So we now have a government that is consistently responding to new lows that the opposition are laying out in terms of fear campaigns, in terms of divisiveness, in terms of the lines and the mistruths. And I say mistruths because in this country, lie is a defamation risk. And we know exactly how defamation goes in this country for reporters. So mistruths. And so I think that has been a pretty defining moment because Peter Dutton now feels like he's got the wind in his sails, that he's got some momentum behind him. And I think we're starting to see Anthony Albanese's long-term plan, which was to have Labor in government for at least a decade, so to win the next election and the election after that. And so in order to do that, to run this middle of the road kind of government where you're doing everything softly and you're not pissing off too many people. I think he's starting to find that is not the time. It's the times are not for the middle of the road approach. The times need some actual stands being made. And I think we're going to start seeing that from next year, but it's probably going to take another shock to get the government to start whirring up the machine and not so much fight back, because it shouldn't be a battle between two political parties, but actually marking out the lines of where politics should be in this country.
Adrian, you're an economics correspondent, and obviously we're, talking a lot about cost of living at the moment. Inflation has been a big problem for families, but also for the government all year. What are some of the big shifts that you've noticed or the big trends that you've noticed this year?
Yeah, well, I think this year, obviously, one of the big talking points has been housing, and that feeds into all the issues around cost of living, inflation, interest rates and so on. So I think the political battleground around housing has been a real flashpoint from an economic reporter perspective. And I think the way that debate has evolved, I think it is still evolving. I don't think we've landed at a point yet in that
because I'm not sure that many people have houses.
Yes, that's right. I think the government's approach, the idea of this 30,000 house future fund, I doubt whether that's going to be the political solution for them. I just can't see that getting the traction amongst voters and amongst people who are renting and want to move into a house, people who want stable housing, people who have a house but can't afford to pay their mortgage. I don't know that their policies so far are going to crack that nut for them.
Yeah, and the Greens are definitely aiming to, I think, use that electorally. They've really harnessed, I think, the cohort of renters in the community in a way that we've probably not seen much before in Parliament. Stephen, you were very recently a journalist, not necessarily working in the gallery, but obviously reporting a lot on a lot of important political issues. What stands out to you from this year?
I think it is the rise of Trump-style disinformation via the Voice referendum, and I think that that's really exposed, and Amy touched on this, a defining feature of what's going to happen in the lead up to the next campaign. Platforming of lies and off-brand terrible disinformation preying on people's fears and insecurities and putting out stuff that's just not true, and that attempt to break down the boundaries between truth and fiction, call fiction truth. And we saw some really sophisticated propaganda from the No campaign linked to the Liberal Party, and I think it's a template for how we will see the coalition campaign in the coming election. That's the number one issue. Obviously the cost of living, which is hurting the government. And the other issue that's less of a defining political issue in terms of who's going to win an election, but I think in policy terms is really important, is the response to climate change, where we've seen one really, really bad policy by the government, which was effectively the adoption of the coalition safeguard mechanism with very small changes and allowing 100% carbon offsets for polluters. And we know that there are serious integrity issues with the carbon offsets, despite a campaign to try to suggest there isn't. So that was bad policy. And then more recently, a pretty good policy to try to advance renewables, a very clever policy which sees the government basically insulate investors from risk, but take the upside, which I don't think really had enough credit. And so they, to me, are the key issues. I don't think that climate change is going to be the feature of the next campaign. It is very much going to be cost of living and trying to work out how to fight the disinformation wars, which throw up as big a challenge for the media as they do for politics.
I was going to say that what I think Stephen has identified is a big deficit in the press gallery. And I mean, I know this is ironic given I'm a member of it, but I'm not a huge fan of the press gallery or of press gallery journalism in terms of us being housed in the same building and being housed in Canberra. I think that can come with a lot of problems, particularly now in this day and age. And I think one of the issues is that we have seen newsrooms chip away at rounds reporting, we've seen newsrooms chip away at resources, and we've seen people start to just react. And journalists excellent at giving the perception of expertise, but there's not really a huge amount of expertise when you peel back in the press gallery. There are reporters like my boss, Catherine Murphy, who has been covering energy policy in this country for over 2 decades, who can understand, what the safeguards mechanism is and isn't, and what the capacity legislation is and isn't. But then there's a lot of people who just take the lines that are said in Parliament and just go, well, blah, blah, blah said this and blah, blah, blah said that, and there you go, make up your own minds. And that's not the job of the media, particularly in this day and age as we are seeing the rise of Trump-style politics. The job for us is to contextualise it and to tell you the history and to explain to you what's going on. But we don't do that because we're afraid then of being accused of bias. And as we have seen in the issue of Gaza and Palestine, that can be a really big fear in newsrooms. If you go, hey, I don't think this is right, then you start to have a lot of the powers that be within newsrooms to say, well, you know what, you're not actually allowed to have an opinion on that. You are allowed to have an opinion because you're a human being. And there's not a single objective journalist in the gallery or in the media at wide, because we are humans and we come to absolutely everything with our own experiences, with our biases. And even if you do a he said, they said, she said story, you're still choosing the language, you're still choosing, who you interview for it, you're still choosing what quotes that you elevate for it. And that is a huge problem when you get to this type of politics. We've seen it in the United States, where the American media showed that it was not up to or fit for purpose covering Trump. And we're seeing it in Australia, where during the Voice campaign, where we were not fit for purpose in covering that. And unless we actually get our act together and work out how to do this in a way that is fair, in a way that serves our audiences, and in a way that gets people the truth that they can then decide what to do with, we are going to be pretty much obsolete.
Can I? Yeah, very good. Can I just quickly add to that? I think we are now at an inflection point in terms of journalism practice about the issue of both-siderism and impartiality. And my concern is that media organisations, be it Nine, be it the ABC, are so fearful about accusations of bias that they confuse the appearance of impartiality for genuine impartiality, which is that you follow the facts and seek the truth, and you have balance that follows the weight of evidence and look to tell the truth wherever it may lead. That's genuine impartiality. The trouble is, if you do that as a journalist these days, there are a whole lot of vested interests, including another media company, that are going to jump on you and accuse you of lacking impartiality. And the bosses at Nine and the ABC, I don't know quite where the Guardian stands, folding on that. They're folding on that and saying we must uphold the appearance of impartiality rather than genuinely doing our jobs of truth-telling.
Could I just jump in there? Just one aspect of particularly what Amy was talking about is resourcing. To me, that is a huge issue in journalism. I don't want this to become a screed about journalism per se, but I think there is a lack of resourcing, and I think that comes down to ownership of media organisations and what the motivations of the owners, their investment in journalism per se, and the job that journalism is meant to be doing. And I feel that is lacking in I suppose, a conversation about the media's role and coverage as well.
Yeah, to give you an idea, I'm actually a former journalist for my sins back in the day, and I used to work at the Herald when that was, a big, fully staffed, before it was the Smage and whatever it is now. And yeah, the lack of rounds and the resourcing, you're right, has been a huge issue for journalism in general. And just noting that we've got 2 people from public broadcasters here tonight. Worth noting that the Australia Institute has looked at support for public broadcasting and how other countries, notably the Nordic countries, do it. And if we were to fund our public broadcasters at the level of Norway, their budgets would approximately triple, just to give you an idea of how other countries do it, and really see it as an investment in democracy, not just journalism, because public interest journalism is, a key thing that underpins a healthy democracy. Pablo, I wanted to come back to the cost of living, which has been such a huge thing this year, and the government's response to it in various ways. Obviously, we've got the huge stage 3 tax cuts looming to come in next year, and the government has been really focused on reducing the cost of living in really quite targeted ways. Has that been enough, or, we're kind of hearing from the backbench maybe they've got to be doing a little bit better? What are your thoughts on how the government's handled that specifically?
Yeah, I do think it's getting to the point where it's been perceived as not being enough, because people are really beginning to feel the sort of everyday pressures grow and grow. It's interesting, a lot of the government's cost of living measures, as you say, they're quite targeted, and they were very much election promises. But I feel like the electorate has kind of, particularly under the previous government, I think in the climate of the last decade, has gotten used to those sugar fixes. When things get tough, one-off payments here and there. And now that the government is in a position where it can't do that, that kind of pressure is amplified. And I think we are starting to see Labor really be tested on this. I think a lot of MPs now are kind of starting to get nervous. The last news poll showed that. I think it is really starting to bite in terms of the electorate beginning to really sort of, I think, turn a little bit on the government around this. And sort of going forward, I think for the government, it's now looking at new policy directions that it has to take next year to try and kind of shift that conversation and change the perception, because I do think that Labor is doing a lot for cost of living pressures, but change that perception that it is not doing enough, or that it is somehow distracted.
Yeah, the distraction thing's been a big theme of this year as well. And I'm just thinking now, I'll stick with you for a second, Pablo, but Anthony Albanese's recent trips overseas for kind of summit season, I mean, oppositions generally give governments a lot of flack for that kind of stuff. But the distraction label was one that was kind of mentioned and that came up a lot. But those kinds of trips are still important. What are your reflections on what Anthony Albanese was able to achieve with some of those international visits?
I think that's probably been one of the big wins for the government this year, is sort of restoring the relationship, particularly obviously with China. That meeting with Xi Jinping, even meeting again with him on the sidelines of the APEC summit, we are starting to see some of those trade sanctions start to be lifted. The problem is domestically, obviously, there is that, I think, a really kind of tired and lazy political attack of, the PM shouldn't be flying around, should be focused on domestic issues. I just think, all sides of politics agree that we are in the most difficult, challenging geopolitical situation since World War II. So here's a thought: perhaps it requires high-level diplomacy, and perhaps it requires Australia being a little bit more at the forefront of these sorts of discussions.
Amy, those visits, obviously, the government always has some clear objectives in mind. I think stabilising that relationship with China was obviously one of them, but AUKUS is another big thing that the government is trying to land. Again, a bit like the stage 3 tax cuts, a hangover from the last government. But those kinds of things are pretty slow moving. There's a huge price tag attached to it though, and a lot of instability in the United States as well, with potentially another Trump presidency coming down the barrel. How much of a risk is some of this international stuff, even if it's not now, that the Prime Minister really has to put in the hard yards now to land it?
I mean, I think if AUKUS actually comes off, I don't know, I'd say I'd eat my hat, but I don't really wear a hat. I don't think AUKUS is going to come off as AUKUS is signed, because it's essentially a deal for the US and, the UK is the minor partner there, the US to give us their technology and their submarines, and for us to get some submarines. But then Australia also has to maintain its sovereignty, because we're not too keen in wandering into a war with China if, something happens with Taiwan. So having the US here, using their tech, having their submarines, but not necessarily definitely on the same side as them, with a looming Trump presidency, with the US Congress already pretty shitty at the idea of giving Australia the submarines, with Australia, normalising its relations with China and the Pacific, and we still, after all of this mess, don't have a frickin' submarine. Defence. If I ran my life the way that this nation runs defence, I swear to God, I would be the highest rated reality TV show the globe has ever seen. It's just every single government goes, here is our defence plan. And every opposition just goes, wah, wah, that's never going to happen. Here's all the mistakes in your defence plan. Then they become the government and they're like, we are 100% behind this defence plan. And the opposition's like, wah, wah, here's all the mistakes in it. And you know what happens? We never get fucking submarines. We don't get helicopters. We don't get giant carriers. We get nothing. We get a lot of announcements. Oh my God, so many announcements. Sometimes we play the Top Gun theme when we announce the announcements, but we don't ever actually see politicians standing in front of equipment saying, it's being delivered. Isn't this amazing? You know what we do get? We get politicians standing in front of equipment saying, we really need to retire this because it's now falling out of the sky, but we're going to extend it for another 7 years while we wait for Operation Taipan Assist, like Tom Cruise to come forth. It is insane. AUKUS, mark my words, will go down that same path. It will. AUKUS is not going to happen.
You seem pretty confident.
Have you actually pitched that show, At Home with Amy Ramirez?
At Home at Amy Ramirez, as we tour defence
I think there could be
sites.
some serious money in that on streaming,
Serious. Looking at this audience, there's a range of generations. Has a submarine actually been delivered in your lifetime? Other than the Colin class, which I think is basically just holding up some ports, cool.
Yeah. Accurate
Hope we don't go to a war, because wouldn't it be awful if the geopolitical situation was absolutely fucked right now, because we might need some of that defence equipment.
Yeah, luckily things are so stable everywhere at the moment.
It's so lucky that the UN is doing its job and we don't have any problems anywhere.
We're going to come back to that in a second. But Stephen, I know you've done a lot of work. I'm just thinking of COP coming up. And you've done a lot of work in the climate space in the past. And I'm thinking here in particular of your comments earlier around offsets. And I know you did a big Four Corners special on how offsets are working in PNG. The government, obviously, it's brought in the safeguard mechanism. It's got, as you mentioned, the big investment in renewables, but there's still a lot of fossil fuels coming down the pipeline and big plans for offsets, 100% offsets for a lot of projects, as you said. How does that pan out when we look at Australia's climate policies internationally and how they operate internationally when it comes to climate change?
That's a very broad question. I think one of the big issues we've got is that we constantly, as a nation and government here, throws its hands up and says, well, we're only responsible for our domestic emissions and we're not responsible for our Scope 3 emissions, the coal that's burned overseas, the gas that goes overseas. That's someone else's problem. But the fact is that we're contributing massively to that problem. I think the very fact that this COP meeting is being held in the United Arab Emirates, from memory, the 7th biggest oil producer in the world. Now, unless they're going to do something drastic and say, hey, we're actually going to stop producing oil, then what is the signal we're sending as a world that we're allowing this to happen in a nation that is a massive oil producer and its best hope is the fiction of carbon capture and storage and all that sort of stuff, and also has a terrible human rights record? Why do we even allow that to happen? There needs to be a radical change in the way we approach it. And what I would hate to see is Australia's view that, You don't need to reduce fossil fuels. You can expand fossil fuels being given any support on the international stage because it's a myth. All the work from the UN, from the climate scientists, even the International Energy Agency, which used to be a slavish supporter of fossil fuels, the whole gamut is saying we have to stop opening new coal mines and producing more gas if there's going to be any hope of saving the world from catastrophic climate change, and yet we're still going ahead. If that gets any support, Australia should really be a pariah on the world stage. We'll see what happens.
We so rarely are. I don't think anyone thinks of us as the petro-state that we actually are. Adrian, I wanted to ask you, there's been a couple of vacancies and changeovers in a couple of big institutions. I'm thinking of the RBA, who is responsible for all the angry letters I get from my bank every month. Well, I'm angry when I open them. They're not angry at me yet, fortunately. And a new head of the Productivity Commission. There's been a few changes at the top, but any changes in how those institutions are running things?
There's changes in the way the institutions themselves run. In terms of what they actually do affecting our lives, so far the signals from the RBA are very much steady as she goes. Michelle Bullock, who's the new governor, has very much taken up the inflation fighting baton from Philip Lowe. And
almost
is running
like she
hard with
spent
it.
her entire career under Philip Lowe and just following along
Who
that
would have
pattern.
thought? Yeah. So there's no particular change on that front. The possibly more interesting changeover in some ways is in the Productivity Commission with the appointment of Danielle Wood to head that. It has the potential to elevate the Productivity Commission to something like it used to be in its old guise as the Industry Assistance Commission, and before that the Tariff Board, when it actually promoted and advanced discussion and public debate about tackling tariffs when the whole protectionism story was very ugly and entrenched across the world, including in Australia. And it was a long, hard struggle. You're talking about decades of work to sort of chip away at the edifice of protectionism and why this is actually not in the country's interests, it's not in people's interests, it's in a narrow handful of people's interests, and just chip away at that. Something similar for the Productivity Commission, if they do stand by the idea that this is an independent organisation, has the potential to lead similar sorts of discussions. I personally think there needs to be a proper reckoning on the tax reform, but I don't know that's where they're going to take it initially. But yeah, that's a big one.
We're going to go to questions from the audience soon, so if you can start putting your thinking caps on, I'd appreciate it. We've got a microphone down the front here where you can come and ask questions of our panel. And my plea to you is that it is a question, please, that you ask and not a speech. Much appreciated. But I feel like we can't move on before we touch on some of the big conflicts that we've seen this year internationally, and some of them playing out in very, very big ways for journalism, a bit like we were talking before about the influence of disinformation. So obviously the 7th of October terrorist attacks in Israel and then Israel's subsequent war on Gaza, the huge humanitarian crisis that we're seeing unfold there, and still no resolution to the war in Ukraine either. There's really not much hope in either of these spheres at the moment. But Pablo, how much has this influenced what's on the political agenda in Australia at the moment and the kind of political response that we've seen to it so far?
I think a lot more than the government anticipated. And we've seen the sort of rhetoric since October 7 kind of shift. Penny Wong walking this very, very fine line between, condemning the Hamas attack, but also calling for restraint. And initially, when she said that, we saw the kind of uproar from the opposition, particularly Susan Ley, who interestingly was Friends of Palestine, and we were looking over some of her speeches and was
co-founder,
there you go, and has done a complete 180 on that one.
You may find in her register of interest that she took a recent trip to Israel, sponsored by the lobby.
Okay, we'll look into that. But I think domestically, as hard as we've seen the coalition come, I guess, in support of its very much pro-Israel stance, I think there is a challenge politically that we're not necessarily seeing at the moment for the coalition in terms of the Arab community in Australia, because we are seeing how hurt both sides of the conflict really are, and they are a massive part of the electorate. And I just, when I've seen this sort of play out over the last few weeks, I just wonder how much of a factor that will be coming up to the next election.
Yeah, because we've seen a lot more Labor MPs who come from electorates with larger Arab populations with much more nuanced messaging around that, really talking about the civilian death toll, the idea of collective punishment and things like that. But Amy, I did want to ask you about the implications for journalism as well, because we've seen a lot of controversy over who gets to report on this, what constitutes impartiality, and I think a little bit the same as we were talking about that challenge for journalism with disinformation and misinformation. This seems like really that struggle for impartiality again, and not really being settled on how you should approach that when it comes to things like this.
I think this is one of the defining moments that you look back on and you either recognised at the time as a defining moment or it took you completely by surprise. And I don't think I have seen a bigger disconnect between the people who hold the power, so the political class, and the popular class, where we're seeing people, particularly younger generations, I would say like from millennial to Gen Z, who are very well aware of the history of Israel and Palestine. And while everyone absolutely condemns what happened in October 7, it is a fact that this did not start on October 7, that the history of what has been happening in Palestine goes back 78 years before October 7. And that is a dangerous thing to say at the moment. That fact is a very dangerous thing to say. And the reason that it's a dangerous thing to say is because we have seen over the decades this conflation between people criticising a nation state, and there is no nation state in this world that is above criticism. There is not a single country that is above criticism in this world. But we have seen a conflation between criticism of Zionism and Israel as a nation state and anti-Semitism. And that has continued over and over the decades. It was before October 7, this was an issue, and it's been an absolute flashpoint since October 7, where anyone who wants to talk about the Palestine story, anyone wants to talk about what happens in Gaza, anyone who wants to talk about what happens in the West Bank or any of the occupied Palestine territory, which, under this government is what we officially call Palestine now. It is the occupied Palestinian territory. That is one of the things that Labor moved before all October 7 happened. And that was on the advice of DFAT. It wasn't a Labor ideological move. It was at the advice of DFAT because of the way things have been moving. All of this has become very, very fraught to the point now where you have editors, people in power, a lot of the establishment journalists who have gone on sponsored trips to Israel to learn about Israel and Palestine. I understand that you do learn about the occupied Palestinian territories when you've been on one of these trips. I have not been on one and would not go on one. That their coverage of what is happening, that's fine. That's the establishment. That's normal. Shari Markson can say anything that she wants on Sky News, and that is acceptable. Anyone who has signed a petition or wants to sign a petition or has expressed support for Palestine, they obviously cannot be objective when it comes to coverage. That is what our newsrooms have told us.
But the big thing is that journalists have pushed back. I think that the letter from the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, endorsed by more than 100 journalists, go and have a read of it. It is one of the best crafted interventions I've seen that is genuinely supporting good journalism and challenging the authority of media companies that have assumed that they can get away with what is actually a biased coverage. And we haven't seen anything like this in decades. It's a very, very significant move.
It is, but what we've seen is the leadership at the 9 newspapers say any journalist who has signed that cannot cover or report on anything that is happening in regards to the conflict.
And the ABC's news director say, don't do it. It may lead to questions about your impartiality.
Well, but there's no questions on the other side, is what I'm saying. There's no questions for reporters who have been on these trips. And that is why I'm saying it is a flashpoint in media, because I think that our audiences expect more from us. Our audience expect us to actually declare declare you've signed it. That is public. Declare that you've been on the trips. Our audience want to know where our experiences have led us to. And the idea that you can have newsrooms just clamp down on one side while not acknowledging that maybe somebody who has been on a trip sponsored by an Israeli lobby might be biased in the other direction, that's fine. I think we're seeing a real shaking of that status quo, and it's beyond time that happened, because the way that we've done things always isn't necessarily the best way. I mean, one of the reasons you see journalists push back so much against, social media or Twitter or rage against it or, whatever, is because they're receiving instant feedback on their reports for the first time in their careers. And it's kind of shaken them a little. And I think news companies are starting to see instant feedback on these sorts of unilateral decisions. So this is a seismic time for the media industry. It is a time where we work out how we move forward, how we deal with journalism in the modern age, which is accepting that reporters are going to have opinions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't report on something. It just means that their audience needs to know that where those opinions are coming from, because that's who we serve. The first part of the Journalism Code of Ethics is to serve our audiences. But we're consistently seeing over the last few decades, media organisations revert back to how media organisations started, which is serving particular interests, be it the fossil fuel industry, be it big business, or be it just the establishment and the status quo. And that needs to change, because you guys, you're all changing. How you consume news is changing. And if our bosses don't get with the picture, again, we are going to be obsolete.
Thanks, Amy. I can't believe no one has any questions. Come on down if you've got a question. We've got a microphone here. So, who's going to get there first? That's a race. Thank you.
You can see from the T-shirt that I'm wearing what the question might be about.
Yeah.
Now, in your collective wisdom and all you folks behind me, do you think we'll see Julian Assange back in Australia alive or in a box?
That's a good question.
Anytime soon.
Who wants to take that one first?
We are seeing a pretty big shift in the parliament across the political divide. So we recently had a delegation of politicians from the Teal crossbench, from the Nationals, from the government, from the Liberal Party, who went and spoke to people in the US. And then we saw a letter in response to from politicians across the political divide. So you had people from the Squad, so like AOC, signing up with hardcore Republicans to say we need to drop this prosecution. It has been one of the big issues that Anthony Albanese has been speaking to Joe Biden about, both, within the official bilaterals and also under private channels. We both now have the Liberal Party under Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese as the Prime Minister saying that this has gone on for long enough and it needs to come to a close. All indications are that every single diplomatic channel is being pushed when it comes to this. It is going to come down to US politics, but it does seem like there is a shift there as well. I think that if we're going to hear news, it has to be in the next couple of months, and if we don't hear about it then it's not going to be great news.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the political momentum is as good as it's ever going to be in terms of the sort of across the divide support. And yeah, I think if it's not going to happen now or anytime soon, I kind of worry if it is going to happen.
Next question.
Well, my name is Andrew Clixon. I'm a professor of climate science at the University of New South Wales. My question is, why did the government prohibit or cover up on the climate report of the future generations? And I also have the answer, because the report and the state of the climate have been grossly underestimated. It's far more serious now for the government to let people know what is actually happening. And I will not take the time here, but I will say that what is happening is much, much more serious than most people think.
Thank you very much. Stephen, do you want to take that one first?
I think he's pretty much summed it up with his answer. It's not the first time we've seen governments suppress those reports either. There's a history of delaying them when they are due to be released at politically inopportune moments. And we consistently see Australia, even on the most optimistic estimates, failing to meet the challenge it set itself for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I agree, it's dire. It's a real worry that it's not recognised just how dire it is and how urgent it is that we take action.
I think you could also point to the Tuvalu Agreement, where we've agreed to accept citizens in the event of a climate emergency, ahead of a climate emergency, that even while the National Security Report is not public, I think we can all pretty much imagine what it's saying.
And I would just say, I think it'll be interesting to watch the space in the Pacific, whether more deals like this are going to happen, because the concern from PIF countries is, existential.
Yeah, and Australia is suppressing pushback in the Pacific. That is clear. If you look at the communique from the last Pacific Leaders Forum, it was essentially watered down to give an out clause for Australia. It went from looking at a fossil fuel-free Pacific to allowing for individual circumstances of particular entities and yada yada. Whole lot of weasel words.
Next question.
I know budget's a really big thing for journalists as well as politicians, so I'm really interested to hear what you guys think are going to be the big issues for the coming budget in next year.
Sure. Look, I think it'd be very odd if they didn't tackle the whole issues around cost of living as probably the centrepiece of the budget. What form exactly that takes, it's all the signals are from the government that they're not interested in big handouts because they know that that's can exacerbate the inflation problem. So, but they will, I think, have to come to the table with something from the budget that goes to that space. Yeah.
Cost of living will be the central feature, I think, of all of next year going up to the next election. Ebony, you touched on the point about renters. Obviously, the Greens, I think, are running a very sophisticated and disciplined campaign. But it was interesting, Allegra Spender this week in Question Time actually also asked a question about renters from an electorate of Wentworth, which obviously is quite an affluent electorate. But I think it just goes to show how big of a cohort of the electorate this is. And renters are going to be, I think, something that the government really does need to focus on electorally.
Well, we're one third. We're 1/3 of the population.
We
so,
are.
And yeah, as you pointed out, there's still probably a lot of renters in a suburb like Wentworth.
and
it's
we've
all
seen
across
One of the
Australia.
highest proportions in the
and
country.
we've seen recent reports showing that it's actually cheaper to pay off a mortgage than to rent in a lot of cities. And with, Canberra, if you rent in Canberra, you would know exactly what the Canberra rental experience is like and how much extra that you are paying for a place that probably doesn't have insulation or, heating or, in a lot of cases, a hot water system that'll last beyond like one hot shower. So these are going to be a huge issue. I would also say that the activity test will most likely be scrapped when it comes to childcare as the government incrementally moves towards its plan to make childcare a universal right in Australia like it does in terms of Medicare. But all of this is going to be very, very, very slowly, and unless the government starts addressing inequality, I think they're going to find themselves in a pretty big shock when it comes to the election campaign.
Yeah, and Stephen, today we saw some reports that Labor backbenchers are urging an overhaul of the stage 3 tax cuts. If we want to talk about cost of living and spending, that's a $300 billion odd hit to revenue coming down the pipeline, and most of it going not to people who are really struggling to make ends meet. Do you think they're on the table?
I think that if Anthony Albanese is willing to get over the fear of being branded as having broken an election promise, there is a political circuit breaker there for the government. The Australia Institute's outlined various ways that you could rejig the tax cuts so benefits went to low and middle income earners rather than overwhelmingly supporting people in the top 2 or 3% of income. And economically, politically, to me, it's a no-brainer. You look at where the people who are hurting most from the cost of living crisis live, and it's renters, and in terms of mortgages, it's people living in the outer suburban areas, regional areas, not in the inner cities where affluent people tend to live. But it's not going to lose them many votes in the inner cities because they're either Labor, because predominantly you've got Labor, Green or Teal voters, and the ones who aren't that way are never going to vote Labor anyway, whereas they could win support out where people are really struggling on modest incomes by actually rejigging those tax cuts. It's an obvious political fix, and I don't know, it is only fear that's stopping them doing that. Beyond that, they do have a difficult dilemma because a lot of what you can do to assist people, the traditional handouts, the caucus race from Alice in Wonderland, everybody has won and all shall have prizes, doesn't work in an era of inflation. So it's a harder task. So it's not going to be the easy budget that it was. It's going to take some clever thinking. But the other thing that's become clear is boasting you've got a big budget surplus isn't going to cut much mustard that day either.
I'd just say very quickly prediction, and journalists shouldn't make predictions because we're mostly idiots and we don't actually know anything. But I do think that the government won't touch stage 3 tax cuts in this term, but it will be part of their election platform. They'll then say, we have a mandate to do it after we've told you that this is so hard. And I think the precursor to that has been the superannuation changes that they've announced, the tax changes, like the very, very modest ones where they're not actually doing it until the next term of government, so it'll be part of a mandate. I think the election campaign will see some of the stage 3 tax cuts, be it a rejiggering, a moving of the thresholds, that sort of thing. It'll form part of that.
You think they'll defer them?
I think that they'll probably start to put them through for that 2024 because they said that they would. And the Labor usually, when it comes to government, usually inherits really terrible economic times. That has been the history of the Labor Party. They inherit really awful economic times, then they start getting things back on track, and then everyone's got the shits and have elected the Liberals back, who then ride like the Labor policies, like, for the next 10 years or so, and then everyone just goes, hang on, no, these guys are terrible, and throws them out and puts Labor back in, and then we have another, economic dip. And so I think that's where we're here now, and the circuit breaker that this Labor government are trying to do is to say, we are not going to break promises. We're not like the Labor's governments that you knew of old. We're going to be sensible when it comes to this stuff. But hey, during the election campaign, have you guys noticed the economy? I think that's what you're going to see.
Can I just really quickly, just on the point that you made, Stephen, about it being a political no-brainer. I mean, when you look at it, the economics of it, it does make sense. But I think it goes back to what Amy and you guys were saying about the tactics we saw in the No campaign, the vindication that we've seen for some of those tactics of a complete fear campaign and mistruths that Labor is really worried about.
My dad doesn't have anything resembling franking credits. He is on the pension. I help support my father. In 2019, my dad thought that the government was coming for his franking credits. I was like, what is a franking credit, Tete? He's like, I don't know, but they're coming for it.
I've been having this recurring dream where Peter Dutton arrives with a wand and waves it and kills all the front bench, the Teals and the Greens, and Jason Clare's just lying there with a scar on his forehead. Don't know what that's all about.
Have you considered therapy?
Well, for coming tonight. I'm Craig Andrews from AAPB. My question is regarding the influence of America, and whoever America is, there's a government there, but there's something behind it, as we all know. Our politics and our journalism team seems to toe the line a little bit too much, and people, including the media, seem to be afraid to speak up. You know, including the Assange case, I think Albo should be stamping his feet and banging the table rather than squeaking in Biden's ear. We have Dan Duggan locked up in Lithgow now, just over 400 days. No one's really talking about it beyond, we could have done this. We're not taking a stand against anything America does. They've been behind every major war in the last century, and we keep following them there.
Have you got a question, sir?
The media is not really stepping up, to my satisfaction, against America. Can you explain, anyone explain why?
Just read Noam Chomsky.
Australia is a middle power, and most of our media is focused on covering domestic issues. I'm not sure how you would want the Australian media scene to front up against America. And I mean that in all seriousness. Like, what would you expect the Australian media to do, and what impact would you expect that to have? I think the only way that you can address it is what we're seeing happen, is is the raising of the Assange case, is the raising of the issues around sovereignty when it comes to AUKUS, is raising the issues of America's relationship with China and how that impacts us, is raising the issues of Australia's relationship with the Pacific and how that impacts America and how they need to maybe keep a foot out.
But I reckon this chap has a point. If you look at AUKUS, the coverage overwhelmingly out of the press gallery was almost celebratory when it was announced. Little questioning except for, it's a very big number. And it wasn't until Paul Keating came out and said, no, this is rubbish, that you started to get a little bit of a contest. I think we are overly slavish towards America, that there's a whole class of journalists who've come up in an era where they are non-questioning. My first assignment out of my home city was to go and cover the anti-bases protests against Pine Gap. Pine Gap's being used in the war there now. We don't hear much about, in the war in Gaza now, giving intelligence to Israel. We don't hear much about that. And journalists routinely trot out to ASPI, who are basically a paid-up member of the military-industrial complex, sponsored by Raytheon and a whole lot of armaments companies, and we treat them like they're objective commentators in ways we wouldn't with, an organisation of a different political stripe, shall I say. So I think there is a point. There's a lack of questioning of America. You look at the way we look at China and the way we look at America now. I'm not someone who doesn't say there are legitimate issues to raise about China and the threat it poses and its policies and its human rights. But we treat America like a benign power rather than an imperial power, which has a history of disastrous interventions around the world and war crimes. Iraq.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I would also point you to Australia's security laws, of which Labor and the Liberals are about to pass another whole suite, which makes reporting of any type when it comes to security basically a national offence, and also our defamation laws. And we have seen reporters and whistleblowers not receive any sort of backing when it comes to the government of acting in the public interest. And so until, people start to rise up and demand that their politicians start changing the laws, there is going to remain a leash around the Australian media.
And our final question, thank you.
Coming back to domestic politics, Australia's had a few new premiers in the past year. How well have they performed, and how have they done taking over from the big personalities left by their predecessors?
Who wants to tackle that one first? I'm going to dob you in, Pablo.
Yeah, Pablo.
Look, I think, all right, let's go to New South Wales. I think Chris Minns is showing some teething issues, shall I say. I think Labor hasn't been in government for such a long time. So there are some issues there. I think, for instance, with Dan Andrews, probably a little bit too early to say with Jacinta. How long has she been in?
Only a couple of months.
Not very long.
They only just elected a new member for Dan Andrews' seat, so.
Yeah. It is a pretty hard act to follow, just putting into context the role that they had with COVID. I think it's a little bit tricky to kind of compare it, because I think the politicians, across the country really became personalities of how kind of upfront they were in the public's mind. But, I mean, I haven't seen any major disasters just yet. I mean, is that a good measure of good success?
I think we're about to see the last COVID Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk. She will lose government in October. Unless there is a massive, massive turnaround in that state, the LNP are going to win in October. That is a sign of the fatigue of governments in their third term, but also I think the fatigue of Anastasia Palaszczuk, who, if you're not a Queenslander, you don't understand just how much she was adored in Queensland even before COVID. And she is exhausted. It's obvious that Palaszczuk is exhausted, and it can't keep being the state's aunt, which is a benevolent role that most people felt that she filled. But I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with the end of personality politics when it comes to the premiers. Politicians are not your friends. They certainly shouldn't be your heroes. And so, putting politicians up on a pedestal, and yes, I can totally understand it, because they literally had our lives in their hands during the pandemic, and it was the premiers that literally dragged the Morrison government into things like quarantine, into lockdowns, into getting the vaccines, into actually trying to address the fact that this was a pandemic and it was coming for us. It was the premiers who did that, and they did rule our lives because, during that time, those press conferences were the highest rating TV shows on television. And I think it's also part of the reason why, so much of our audience is fed up with us, because they know exactly how the sausage is made now, and it's not attractive, and you're all a lot more media literate than you might have been before the pandemic because you've watched so many press conferences. But again, politicians should not be your heroes, and I think that when the public did put the state premiers on such a pedestal, it kind of also stops scrutiny, because even when it was fair scrutiny, and absolutely not all of it was, but when it was fair scrutiny and fair questions, people just immediately assumed that it was part of a plot to bring down that particular premier. That is not true. There's a lot of shit that goes on in state politics, and it needs more of a spotlight.
The other thing that would be interesting to see, just with the turnover of state and territory leaders, just the dynamics around the whole national cabinet process, and whether this is an idea which is, still has legs in it, and what its purpose is now, and whether there's a forum like that has a role, or whether it drifts off.
I was going to say that one positive you could say about Chris Minns is that he hasn't been found to have engaged in corrupt conduct like his predecessor. But Amy actually suggested to me another positive. He's certainly taking the personality out of politics.
We might wrap it up there. Please thank our panel, Stephen, Amy, Pablo and Adrian.
This has been a summer series episode of Follow the Money. You can find all our upcoming webinars and events and our research at australiainstitute.org.au. You can follow us on Twitter at the Oz Institute. And if you want to connect with me, I'm Ebony_Bennett with a N_T. Our producer is Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Hope you're having a great summer. Thanks for listening.